I walked into the bridal suite and found my boyfriend wearing the groom's boutonniere. That sentence sits in my head like a car crash on a loop. Sudden, awful, impossible to ignore. For a second, I couldn't tell if I was looking at a man who'd ruined my daughter-in-law's wedding or at a terrible, surreal joke. The suit fit him the way a lie fits a practiced liar, stitched perfectly, tailored confidence in every seam. The tiny white flower pinned to his lapel was the punctuation mark I couldn't swallow. He looked up at me and smiled like someone who had already counted the money. My name is Margaret Thompson, but everyone calls me Maggie now because the world got sloppier with the formalities after Tom died. I was married to him for 32 years. Tom was the kind of man who never left the toilet seat up and never missed a family dinner. When he was gone, the silence in the house had a shape. It was a recliner, a chessboard in the corner, the smell of his aftershave on an unused shirt. I learned to answer to widow at weird moments, funeral directors, the nice man from the cemetery, but mostly I was learning who I was outside of the life we'd built together. I worked as a paralegal. You'd think that would make me suspicious. I could read contracts, spot a forged signature if it was neon on the page. But grief is a very effective eraser. It smooths over the edges you promised yourself would always sharpen your senses. I started dating again because nobody had warned me how lonely the world could be after losing someone who has been your atlas. Richard. He preferred Robert with friends, but he liked Richard with me. Found me at a fundraiser for the local library. He wore a navy suit and a laugh that sounded like it belonged in a movie, and he knew the names of neighborhoods in the city I'd always wanted to visit. He told me gentle, unlikely stories that made me feel like I was being gently scooped up into someone else's careful life. 3 months later, I could recite his LinkedIn headline without batting an eyelash. Financial consultant. He had an office. He had a watch that cost more than my car. He loved my son's lasagna and had a strange, almost filial way with my old rickety dog. He asked questions I thought were innocent, about retirement accounts, about my late husband's life insurance policy, about the executor of the will. I told myself those questions came from curiosity, not malice. When you want to love again, you learn to translate certain alarms into compliments. My son, Daniel, didn't. Daniel is 32, a software developer who would rather write code than small talk. He has the slow, precise patience that made him an excellent problem solver and a terrible poker player. The first time I brought Richard around, Daniel watched him like a man watching a weather pattern, an eyebrow raised, eyes cataloging. Daniel liked Jessica from the first meeting. She had a laugh that filled a room and a way of moving like it was already her stage. They were engaged 6 months after they met. I bought a dress. We booked the church. All of it should have been ordinary. Second marriages, new beginnings, a family stitched back together. But the seams were already starting to show. There were small things. Richard never took a photo that included me on social media, even when we were at the same table. He deflected when I asked about his past relationships, speaking instead about clients who were more like friends. He asked about the title on our house in a way that made me uncomfortable, but not alarmed, until the first time he asked to come with me to the bank. Just to see, he'd say, smiling with that practiced charm. To help, if there's any paperwork. I told him I could handle it. He sighed as if disappointed, not angry, and then he suggested that he could help me get better returns if I consolidated things. I laughed and said he sounded like my financial advisor. He nodded, and that was enough. If I had been writing this as a paralegal rather than a widow, I might have seen the pattern sooner. I tell myself that now. If you live long enough, something becomes clear. Predators are patient. Grief is a resource. Kindness can be a tool. Richard was all of those things. He could be gently scandalized by television news and piercingly attentive when I tried to recollect a dream. He sent flowers after my birthday in early June. Simple peonies, the right kind of not too loud. He asked about my will without using those clumsy words. He said he liked to plan for the future, which sounds harmless until you remember there are futures someone else could live in too. Daniel asked questions, the sort of quiet ones that made you shift. Does he say where he grew up? He'd ask. Does he ever talk about his family? He would reframe things into code I couldn't hear. At one point, he showed me a text he'd intercepted. He had a way of finding things because he was good at the internet. That's a rounded way of saying he could make a phone tell him its secrets. It wasn't explicit evidence then. It was the kind of thing that gnawed. He called Richard slick in a way that made me bristle. I told him he was being protective. He told me he would show me what he could find, but only if I wanted to know. I did, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because some dull animal part of me needed the facts. Daniel set up a meeting at our kitchen table with his laptop and a stack of printouts. He explained it to me like he would any program. Step 1, identify anomalies. Step 2, corroborate. Step 3, prepare for the outcome. He had recordings, snippets of voice, messages to Jessica, fragments of transactions that didn't add up. He never called them definitive, but he called them worrying. He's good, Mom, he said. He's been practicing this a long time. The wedding date arrived in a soft haze of peonies and pale linens. The reception was at a converted mill with exposed beams, and string lights hung like constellations. Jessica glowed the way people imagine brides do in films, and Daniel, my son, who had always been half skeptical and half sarcastic, looked like a man who'd discovered a room in himself that he hadn't known existed. If you asked me later what my overriding sense was that day, it would be this. I felt like a person watching two parallel plays unfold in the same theater. One was the romantic script everyone expects, vows, a kiss, a ring. The other was a quieter, darker stagecraft Eric and Daniel were rehearsing with a dark sense of choreography. I didn't know which was the real play until I walked into that suite. The bridal suite was upstairs, a room with soft kind of lavender walls we had painted ourselves, a robe draped across a chair, a mirror with lights around it. Jessica had wanted somewhere bright and private to breathe for a moment, away from cameras and pre-wedding adrenaline. I went up, because that's what you do when your daughter's breath hits a wrong pitch. You step into the room and steady the air. I had just pushed the door open when I saw them. Jessica in dress train and smile, Richard in a tux that read Groom in every moral way but one. He was sitting close to Jessica on the settee, one hand at the small of her back, as if that made him official. He had the boutonniere pinned on, the tiny white flower gleaming under the light, and for a moment my brain rewarded me with a stupid private hope. Maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe the photographer asked him to suit up for a shot. Then he looked at me, and his jaw tightened. "Margaret," he said, the voice same as always. The smile was gone. I didn't say anything. My throat moved. I could feel blood warm and heavy in my ears. Someone at the reception downstairs was probably making a speech. Above us, the organist might have been fingering notes. The room smelled like perfume and the kind of floral that will haunt memory because it marks a day. In the middle of that scent, the sight of him, my boyfriend, wearing the groom's proof, was like someone lighting a match in a room filled with papers. Daniel was already there. I hadn't seen him climb the stairs. He stood in the doorway like a judge who'd been waiting for the witness to return. He didn't make a move. He held a small device, a recorder, some small box I would learn later was important, and he smiled in a way that was small and very cold. "Speak now," he said. It took me a beat to realize he wasn't asking the pastor to open the floor to objections. He said it like a line from a film, but it was the wrong kind of theater. Then his phone lit up in his hand, and he played a clip. Jessica's laughing voice, murmuring about the benefits if she married my son. Richard's voice, calm and precise, talking about access, about accounts and paperwork, about arranging things properly. The words were clipped, banal, dangerous because they were so ordinary. The room constricted around me. I tasted metal. "Mom," Daniel said, softer, and it was then that the rest of the plan unfurled. He didn't linger in exposition. He had let this play out long enough to gather proof. He told me later that he'd been following small, ordinary tracks, the courier that kept showing up at odd hours, a pattern of payments to accounts with names that made no sense, photos that captured Richard at odd little signature points. He had stitched together a picture and then showed it to me when he thought I was ready. He'd also been talking to somebody who had badges, a wiry, thoughtful woman named Chen. I didn't know that name yet. Daniel didn't say more than necessary in that corridor of a room. People filled the doorway. Someone gasped. Someone seemed to think it was an artful interruption. Someone else's face was delighted at the prospect of drama. I felt like a window being ground open from the inside out. Jessica's smile slid. Her hands tightened on the fabric of her dress. Richard's jaw worked. He looked dangerous in the way that practiced predators do when cornered. Calm, like a man who had always been rehearsing his escape routes. "You're making a mistake," he said to Daniel, and for the first time there was heat under that suaveness. The calm was a theater curtain pulled aside. The man behind it came into view. "Not my mistake," Daniel said. He reached into his pocket and slid a thin stack of printed bank statements and screenshots across the dressing table. They were bland, account names, transfers, dates, until you read them like a map that was suddenly legible. Then everything looked like an expressway straight to terrible places. Someone whispered FBI from somewhere in the corridor like a prayer or a curse. I didn't know yet why that whisper had more weight than usual. Later, I would learn about careful calls from Daniel to a handler that had started weeks before. All the small moves of a chess game played in a kitchen with pastry and code. Right then, in that crowded suite smelling of flowers and panic, the first 2 arrests happened. The officers were not some cinematic SWAT team. They were plain-clothed agents who moved with the efficiency of people who had rehearsed discretion for years. One of them, short, intense, wearing a jacket that might have been part of a business suit if you looked fast, showed a badge. He said the word FBI and the room shifted. It was not violent. It wasn't loud. It was legal, and for the first time since the day I said yes to coffee with Richard, I believed someone else was standing between me and what could have been a slow, terrible erasure of everything I'd worked for. They took Richard and Jessica in handcuffs quietly enough that the tape on the live feed would later cut the moment into neat sound bites. I heard snippets, conspiracy, elder fraud, forgery, and my head tried to translate them into something less accusatory. My legs felt hollow. I wanted to laugh, to vomit, to start screaming at the ceiling of the bridal suite. I did what you always do in disasters. I held my son's hand. Afterwards, there was a chaos that moves in 2 tempos. The one the bridesmaids ran on, tears, frantic calls to restock bouquets, and the other that law enforcement moves in, interviews, polite but firm requests that people stay for statements. Daniel's face was the same after the arrests as before. Quiet, efficient, like someone who'd cleared an obstruction from a machine. He kissed Jessica on the forehead as if to say, "I'm sorry this had to be public," and I wanted to believe he was sorry for the insult to the day, not for the outcome. Daniel refused to let me be the rubble of this scene. "It was never just about you, Mom," he said to me later as we sat in my car parked under a curtain of maple leaves, the reception happening around us like a world that had kept breathing even while mine had been altered. "They do this to a lot of people. We caught them before they took the big pieces." He told me, in pieces I would stitch into shape over the following weeks, that the arrests of Richard and Jessica were the first dominoes. They were operatives, middle-level players. The strings leading upward, he used that word, upward, like a map, went to someone named Caroline. I didn't know Caroline Voss. None of us did. But Daniel had discovered the shape of her name in payments, in aliases used in emails, in the pattern of recruitment that looked less like romance and more like predatory engineering. We were quiet when we left the venue. Friends hugged, strangers mouthed apologies. I remember catching sight of Tom's old cardigan folded neatly in the trunk of my car. Habits are hard to stop keeping, and thinking that grief had not been replaced by anger. Anger had simply become a new shape of grief. That night, I replayed the bridal suite image until it was a watermark under everything. Richard's hands near her dress, the boutonniere, Daniel's cold smile as he played recorder like a scalpel. Within 48 hours, a woman in plain clothes called me and asked for a meeting in a diner on Main. She was Agent Chen. She carried a clipboard like someone who liked the anchor of paper, and when she sat down across from me, she described law in a tone that made its edges practical and not theatrical. She said the words elder fraud ring and national and linkages in a voice that lateralized panic into competence. She did not make me feel safer. She made me feel like I was in a place where the problem had frameworks. "We're not going to pretend this is small," she said. "These are professionals. They work in pairs and groups. They put people together who are emotionally vulnerable, recent widows, people in estate processes, and then they do what they can to isolate them." Daniel sat nearby, looking like a man who finally let his shoulders fall because he'd delivered his part of a long job. I sat wrapped in a cardigan with my wedding ring still on my finger because despite everything, some commitments do not unravel with a pair of handcuffs. Agent Chen asked me, plainly, if I'd made any changes to my accounts, if I'd signed anything unusual. I answered truthfully. It felt like policing my own honesty, and I resented every second of it and was grateful at the same time. She explained, in the broadest possible terms that wouldn't let me imagine the playbook of criminals, but would let me understand the stakes, that Richard and Jessica were likely not the ones who started this. They were the hands at the table, but there was a head, Caroline Voss, a woman with a corporate way of talking, who had a portfolio of shell companies and a talent for presenting marriage as a contract people thought was love. Agent Chen's voice lived in the space between empathy and case files. She told me they believed Caroline had used marriage as a way of creating legal access points, aliases, transferred titles, bank signatories, enough that if you married someone else in, you could quietly move money, secure the property, and manufacture legitimizing documents. I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. My head insisted on grays, alleged, suspected, and yet the facts crowded me like people in a small room. Would they hurt people? I asked finally, because the swooping question that had been in the air since Richard's smile began to change was this: how far would they go? Agent Chen didn't answer in headlines. She said, "They will manipulate the law's edges, and sometimes they will cross them. Our job is to stop them before they can change someone's life permanently." She said it without melodrama. The only person in that booth who made a face was Daniel. He leaned forward and said, "We need eyes on Caroline. I think she's recruiting again." I had been content to stand somewhere at the periphery. This could be handled, I told myself, by a phone call and by a few signatures that proved nothing to tomorrow's morning. Then Daniel told me something he hadn't told me before. He'd heard Caroline's name connected to other cases in other states. He'd begun to see a pattern, a woman who didn't love, but who bought and sold another's trust. He thought he could help them find her. He wanted me to help. "You're not asking me to do anything illegal," I told Agent Chen. I couldn't imagine slipping on a costume and talking to a predator. My hands shook at the edge of my coffee cup. "No," she said. "We're asking if you'd be willing to speak with someone from her circle under our direction." She looked at me like someone offering a bridge across a river that's still flowing fast. "We would have you wired. We'd have backup. We don't send civilians into harm's way without a team." I could tell she had rehearsed this answer. It did not comfort me. I thought of Tom, the way he would have laughed at the idea of me wearing a wire to dinner, the way you might laugh at a fish performing Shakespeare. I thought of Daniel's cold smile in the bridal suite like a blade. I thought about how these women, the victims Caroline found, were often lonely, and how loneliness is a currency someone with the right appetite can trade. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you're a victim, and because you're believable," Daniel said simply. "They target people like you because you have assets. You're independent. They think they can charm you. And because—" He looked at me with a tenderness that made me make a small noise. "You've got a spine, Mom." I wanted to say no. I wanted to say I'm old, I'm fragile, I am not a spy. But then I thought of Richard wearing that boutonniere-like armor. I thought of other widows, faces that could be mine in a neighbor's kitchen, and I felt rage. Rage is a dangerous teacher, but it is honest. We didn't decide in the diner that day. There were forms to sign, legal people to meet, fuller briefings, the kind of minutia that makes dramatic stories look more like bureaucratic patience than cinematic courage. Agent Chen explained the limits. "You will not act alone. You will never be asked to commit a crime. You will never be asked to kill, to sabotage, to do anything outside the law." She watched me while she said it like someone who knew the weight of assurance. After the meeting, the world tried to fold back into ordinary motion. Daniel sent a text letting me know he'd arranged for someone to check on my house. Someone from the team would come by later to make sure I had everything set up. It should have been that kind of ordinary. Someone checking the mail, a casserole delivered by a neighbor who meant well. Instead, the ordinary had the texture of a network watching me. I felt the privacy of my home become company property. A week later, a note was left under my door. It was on heavy paper with a small emblem I didn't recognize. The writing was careful, the kind someone uses to make casual threats seem like offers. It said, "We can make things easy. Meet me. Caroline." There was a phone number underneath. I stared at the piece of paper like a person looking at a wild animal in a field. My first instinct was to throw it away and pretend I never found it. My second, more honest one, was to show it to Daniel. He took the paper, looked at the number, and set it on the counter like it was evidence. "Don't call it," he said. "Let them call you. If Caroline reaches out, we'll be ready." There was a rust in his planning that made me feel like a brittle lock being wound. I tried to go about my days. I returned phone calls. I fixed Daniel's favorite stew. I tried to sleep. But under each ordinary act was a steady hunger. Will she? Won't she? Like waiting by a phone for an overdue train. 2 nights later, my phone buzzed. The screen read unknown. I almost let it go to voicemail just to avoid the sensation of being watched. But something small in me, maybe curiosity, maybe the same stubbornness that had made me push through funerals, made me answer. A woman's voice, warm and practiced, said, "Mrs. Thompson, this is Caroline. I was at your son's wedding. Such a lovely affair. I hope you'll forgive my directness, but I wanted to speak with you." She sounded like a woman who drank champagne in the right places. The voice was velvet with an undertone of precise menace. My mouth went dry. I had decided, weeks ago, that when the moment came, I would say no. My lungs remembered the bridal suite like a cage, and my hands tightened into small fists. "Why are you calling me?" I said, louder than I'd intended, and felt the panic of giving my answer its own breath. There was a small, polite pause on the other end. Caroline said, "Because I think we could be helpful to each other, Margaret. There are ways to make difficult things disappear. There are ways to turn a bad day into an opportunity. I'm not a bad person. I am a good negotiator." I thought of the boutonniere. I thought of the way Richard had smiled at me like he'd already counted the coins. I told myself I would be wise, that I would not be baited by smoothness and money. But Caroline offered money with an ease that made my stomach twist. 2 million, she said, as if naming the sound of the ocean. To make your life comfortable. To make whatever the state of affairs is easier. The number detached from reality and floated in the room like a bright balloon. $2 million is a number that does things to people. It rewires decisions. It is both obscene and practical. There was a pause on my end of the call that felt like a tide pulling out. "Why are you offering that?" I asked in the tone of someone bargaining between a life and a principle. "Because you'll be useful," she said softly. "You know people. You have a son who is clever and disruptive. I don't like disruptions. I don't want difficulty. I would prefer to smooth things over. I would prefer to give you something that makes this vanish." My skin prickled. Vanish how? Caroline laughed a little, the kind of laugh that sits over a dangerous thing to make it seem like entertainment. "Quietly," she said. "Cooperatively. We could use someone of your disposition. Or we could pay you to be silent and let this pass." My head swam. The call ended with Caroline's promise to meet. She gave a place, an upscale bakery with the kind of porcelain cups people in her world liked, and a time. She said she would send a driver. I told Daniel. I told Agent Chen. The three of us, mother, son, federal agent, sat around my kitchen table like conspirators in a kitchen that smelled of lemon and sadness. I felt ridiculous and heroic and terrified and strangely alive in a way that made me both proud and ashamed. Daniel wanted me to say yes to the meeting, but only if it could be used. "If she wants to recruit you," he said, "we let her recruit you, under supervision. We collect what she says, and she thinks she's won herself a new player." Agent Chen's face was a map of cautious optimism. "This is how we draw lines," she said. "We keep you wired. We control the room. If she offers you the money, it's evidence. If she proposes anything worse, it's confirmation." That night, I lay awake thinking about choices I had never imagined being asked to make. I had loved a man who was quiet and dependable. I had trusted a man who turned out to be a player in a game I hadn't known existed. I had a son who could break into servers, and a federal agent who trusted him enough to let him be the instrument of justice. And somewhere out there, a woman named Caroline thought she could make me choose silence for comfort. There are moments in life that feel arranged to force you to measure what you are willing to be for a price. I kept thinking about the widows Caroline targeted. Maybe the women who, like me, had been promised futures in notes and nicknames. I thought about the faint hope that justice might be dismantled piece by a network if someone didn't step forward. The decision formed itself not as a single choice, but as a series of small ones. Don't let grief be erased by someone else's appetite. Let your son not have to bury the results of what predators can do. In the early morning light, I made myself tea and looked at the wedding photo that had been printed from my desk. Daniel laughing with his head thrown back, Jessica leaning in, string lights like a low summer sky behind them. The photo had not yet been recut by anything except the truth. I put the picture face down and dialed the number on Caroline's message. "Make sure the wire is on," I told Agent Chen when she answered on the line. "I will," she said. I was about to walk into a room with a woman who saw me as a commodity. I was about to keep the boutonniere memory alive in service of something that felt like a larger writing. I told myself I would be careful. I told myself some other, quieter lies to keep my hand steady as I put on lipstick and pinned a small, forgettable flower into my lapel. The one I chose was pale, a kind without a story, because I didn't want to wear a symbol the way Richard had. When I left the house, my son kissed the top of my head like a benediction. He said, "Be stubborn, Mom, not reckless." I thought that was a fair request. I stood on the threshold like a woman who had, for too long, been led through doors that somebody else opened for her. Now I was the one walking toward a table where someone would try to buy my silence. I didn't know then that sitting down at that bakery table would be the start of a long year in which I'd learn the sounds of other people's lies. I didn't know I'd learn how to speak like someone who didn't know, or that I would have to pretend to accept money that wasn't mine to keep, or that I would be forced to listen to offers that sounded like kindness, but were weapons. I didn't know, either, the scale of the thing Caroline had built or the cost of dismantling it. All I knew in that moment was the weight of the boutonniere in my memory and the way my son's hands felt in mine. I closed my front door and walked to the car. The world smelled like rain on hot pavement. My heart was a drum that kept asking me whether this was about vengeance or survival. Caroline's driver arrived in a car that smelled faintly of lemon. The woman herself appeared like someone stepping out of a glossy magazine, impeccably dressed, an obliging smile ready, eyes that measured the room before they landed on me. She offered a handshake that was practiced. Her fingers were cool. "Margaret," she said, and for a terrifying second the word felt like a deal being named. "Thank you for coming." She sat down as if she were welcoming a neighbor, and the bakery hummed with the innocent noises of brunch. The contradiction between the domestic and the dangerous is always what makes these moments feel cinematic. She ordered coffee, and it came like a prop, white ceramic, too bright. "2 million," she began without preamble, "for your cooperation or your silence. It depends on what you prefer." Her eyes flicked to mine the way a trader checks another's countenance. She spoke in the neutral cadence you use when making offers that are both generous and transactional. "You understand," she said, "that people who refuse can cause a scene." I felt old the day I realized how transactional the world could be. I thought of Tom's hands, calloused and honest, folding laundry and paying the bills without a ledger of conscience being kept like a separate book. I thought about Daniel's carefulness, and I thought about Agent Chen's clipped sentences that made me feel both safer and smaller. "Why me?" I asked again, because the only honest question in the room felt like the one I needed to anchor myself to. "Because you are convincing," Caroline said. "Because people like you don't expect to be taken. Because you have a son who will make noise, and sometimes it's useful to have a person willing to be the face of a thing while the rest of the work continues." She smiled, a motion that was small enough to be considered polite and large enough to be considered a threat. It was then that I realized something sharper. This woman saw me and already knew how to put me on a shelf, how to unbalance me with promises. She talked as if the offer of money could be both balm and cord. She was offering me my life in exchange for complicity. I put my hands on the table and felt the grain of wood under my palm. I was some mixture of betrayals. Betrayed by the man who'd worn the groom's boutonniere, betrayed by my own capacity to want kindness, betrayed by a system that let predators practice their craft. I looked at Caroline and did something slow and considered. I smiled back and said, "What does cooperation mean to you?" She told me anecdotes about other women, not as people, but as examples. "People like me," she said, "help others find better outcomes." There was a kind of quiet I have since learned to recognize, the moment in which the predator shifts from being charming to being bureaucratic. I would learn to hear that sound again and again. For now, though, I had a decision to make, to let this woman seat herself in my future, or to use the moment as a net to trap her. "That's not a conversation I can have alone," I said finally. "You're asking a lot." She reached across the table as if to reassure me, and I felt an instinctive recoil, the way a skittish animal might step back from a hand offered with sugar. "We can make it easy," she said. "We can make you comfortable." Outside, the world went on. Someone laughed too loud. A child asked for an extra cookie. In that din of ordinary life, I felt the enormity of the choice like an undertow. I thought of weddings I had attended, where a small kindness had saved someone's life. I thought of funerals where the right question had been the only thing standing between someone and disaster. At that exact point, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. "Are you sure you want me to watch?" The line under it was a small, plain emoji, an eye. I typed back an answer I didn't fully mean yet. "Yes." He replied with a thumbs up and nothing more, and the bakery sound returned to normal like a tide. Caroline tilted her head and asked, "Is that your son?" "Yes," I said. "He's very involved." Good. She folded her hands as if concluding a chapter. We'll keep it simple. Meet me next week at... The sentence dangled like a thread I could either follow or cut. My hands rested on the table. In the small interval between one breath and the next, I realized how much of this story I had stepped into, not because I sought adventure, but because I could not bear the idea that other people would be placed where I had been, small, betrayed, alone with the task of picking up what predation had left behind. I said, I'll think about it, because sometimes you must choose the truth that allows you the most time to plan. Caroline nodded, like a woman who just heard the answer she expected. She offered a business card with an address I recognized as one a lot of consultants use. Caroline tucked her card back into her slim clutch, as if we'd just settled a question about the weather instead of bartering for my future. I walked to my car with the card folded like a secret, and the taste of coffee still on my tongue. I had agreed, in that small, practical way, you agree to a doctor's appointment, because it felt necessary, because someone else told you it mattered. Only later did I understand how much I'd signed with that gesture. The preparations were unspectacular in the way that real danger usually is. Agent Chen and a technician, an easygoing man named Marcus with a winter scarf even in June, came to the house. They explained things like they were explaining a recipe. Don't chew on the microphone pack. If something feels unsafe, pull your hand out and make noise. The wire will pick up most things, but don't expect salvation to come through a little plastic box. They showed me a tiny camera attached to a brooch they'd pinned near my collarbone that I pretended not to notice, and then learned to forget until it mattered. What if it shows up on my sweater? I asked, because old habits die in the form of practical worries. It'll look like a brooch, Agent Chen said. You'll be wearing a nice brooch. Daniel sat in on every meeting like a man afraid his mother might forget the lines. He read legal waivers the way some men read instruction manuals, slow, thorough, and then again in different light. He hummed to himself when the techs adjusted the mic. He checked the batteries like a father smoothing a child's hair. He'd been part of the plan from the first hour after the boutique suit and the boutonniere. He'd been the quiet architect who'd turned panic into evidence. Now he was my lookout. I'll be with you on everything, he said. You're not doing this alone. Of course not, I said in a way that was both grateful and mildly scandalized, because it felt ridiculous that my 47-year marriage had prepared me for trust, but not for wires. I kept thinking, with an odd tenderness, of Tom blending his cereal and leaving the box open on the counter, and how none of that would have taught me how to negotiate a sting operation. The first few meetings were small talk and the art of pretending. Caroline had a way of asking questions that felt like flattery, until you remembered they were mapping you. She asked about my childhood home, about my husband's habits, about whether I had siblings. She praised my son's success with an intimacy that meant she'd cycled through a dossier someone had made about us. When she asked how I felt about being in the public eye after the bridal suit incident, she called it an awkward moment. She sounded like a woman who enjoyed shaping narratives for other people. Margaret, she said once, leaning forward as if I were the only person in the room, people like me give people options. 2 million is freedom to some, closure to others. We can be a kindness. She used the word kindness like a scalpel. At first, her offers were politely rehearsed. She would drop phrases. We value discretion. It's more about arrangement than permanence. And then sit back, waiting to see what would catch. She never raised her voice. She smiled in a way that made you measure your own reaction like a thermometer. In the early meetings, she floated the idea of a partnership, introductions to trusted advisors, a future that included a tidy portfolio and international weekends that sounded like postcards. Daniel watched her in a way that made me certain he was cataloging adjectives. She's good, he said once later, when it was just the three of us at my kitchen table. She's excellent at presentation. We need her to keep talking. Agent Chen nodded. We do, but not without backup. So we kept letting her talk. We let her believe I could be swayed. The first real test was at a dinner Caroline hosted at a hotel bar that smelled of citrus polish and expensive leather. She had arranged the room like a stage. Candles, small plates, soft music that faded into the background, so your attention had to go to the people. She introduced me to 2 names I would learn were pieces on her chessboard. Linda, who tended to laugh in the precise spots that made people relax, and Victor, who listened so intently you nearly forgot what you'd been about to say. They were operatives, real hands in the operation, or at least the people Caroline wanted me to believe were. "Margaret," Linda said at one point, hooking her finger around a glass, "people are complicated. Sometimes the easiest way to get what you need is to let someone act like they love you. It's practical." The casualness of her words made my throat close. I laughed then, a small sound that was more shock than humor. "You seem to believe in practical love," I said, "because the thing you learn early in a sting is that the bait is rarely crude. It's always elegant." Caroline admired my laugh like a small sculpture. "We are practical people. We create arrangements that work, financially, socially. Why let the messy parts of life ruin opportunities?" That was the gilded version. The darker version came when Caroline spoke of scale. At the hotel bar, she did not speak in euphemism. She told anecdotes, thinly fictionalized stories about women who had accepted arrangements and then found themselves comfortable, cared for, secure. She did not tell stories about the women who resisted. In those moments, something inside me stiffened with rage so deafening that I had to force my face into ordinary composure. I thought of the bridesmaids sobbing, of the hush when the badge was shown, and of the bridal suite where Richard had been, part showman, part thief. I thought of other widows who drank their tea alone and answered the phone with a voice that was already tired. I thought of the way grief makes ordinary people allowed for predators. I let them talk, and I let the mic record. There were small victories in those early hours. Caroline mentioned names, briefly, almost negligently. She referenced an address in another state, a corporate name that sounded innocuous, a charitable foundation that had a suspiciously tidy ledger. She was proud of her network. Her voice held the giddy pleasure of a person showing off a well-crafted machine. Every time she did this, I felt my stomach dip, because each breadcrumb seemed to feed a wider map. Then the ask came. It was not dramatic. Caroline was not a woman of dramatic reveals. One evening, after I'd been invited to a small dinner that smelled faintly of rosemary and old wood, she tilted her head and said, "We value loyalty, Margaret. We like when people show commitment." "What kind of commitment?" I asked, because that was the only way to keep the question from sounding like an admission of ignorance. "Showing your seriousness, helping us by doing small things when needed, being flexible." Her eyes held mine like someone checking the temperature of a surface before touching it. Flexible is a lovely euphemism for a lot of terrible things. I asked for examples, and she gave me hypotheticals, helping a friend arrange something delicate, the kind of language that would have been innocuous without context. But then she did something I had not yet seen her do. She mentioned names. "We have someone who is a nuisance," she said, "a woman at the bureau who asks too many questions. We prefer her to go quiet." For a split second, the whole room smelled of bleach. I felt the edges of a memory, Agent Chen's quiet face, the clip of her badge in the bridal suite, and then I forced myself to breathe. "What do you mean by go quiet?" I said. My voice came out like a measured instrument, and Daniel's hand, hidden beneath the table, made the smallest, quick squeeze. Caroline's smile tilted, not unkindly. "We would always prefer to avoid trouble, but sometimes someone who cannot be negotiated with becomes an obstacle." That was the line. It could have been a line in a play. It also could have been a plan. I remember looking at her face as if it were glass, and something ugly was trapped behind the pane. She spoke as if the word violence were a commodity you could buy and parcel out. Inconvenient people could be neutralized. Threats could be removed. She did not say, kill. She used words like remove and make inactive. But there was an inference so sharp it left a small cut. My stomach folded into itself. I had known, intellectually, that criminal networks sometimes employed muscle. I had not imagined that I would be asked, however obliquely, to assent to harm. There was a moral canyon between being a woman who accepted a dinner and a woman who consented to make someone vanish. The canyon's edge yawned open. I did something then I suspect most people in my shoes would do. I bought time. I smiled carefully, thanked Caroline for the lovely evening, and left. When I walked back to my car, the night felt suddenly like a theater exiting into a different world, one where the lights were harsh and the actors had mentioned only the barest of stage directions. I told Daniel and Agent Chen. Daniel's face hardened in a way I'd only ever seen when he was debugging a program and the code refused to behave. Agent Chen went quiet for a long time. "We need to document this," she said at last. "We need a clearer recording of that phrase, of any direct mention. We can't arrest on implication. We need evidence that shows the intent." In the weeks that followed, I learned the art of listening like a person trying to catch a faint confession in a crowded room. We staged meetings that Caroline thought were private, but were wired in ways I had only imagined in spy novels. I wore dresses with seams that would hide a mic, sat at tables where servers unwittingly placed our cups in the same positions so the camera could frame our faces, and listened for the turn of phrase that would prove the suggestion had been more than a suggestion. It was difficult in the way that fears are. You feel ridiculous until you don't, and then you feel a different kind of ridiculous for having been brave. There were nights I lay awake convinced I'd failed the test, and nights I woke so certain I'd collected the necessary threads that I felt dangerous enough to sing. Caroline continued to recruit around me. She put me in touch with other women she claimed were in transition, married recently, nervous about a change in their portfolios, smiling in ways that suggested a practiced acceptance. Some of them were lonely. Some of them were hungry for the stability Caroline promised. Some were, as I later learned, also operatives who played both sides when necessary. The entanglement was thick. It was heavy like a quilt made of other people's suffering. The escalation to the warehouse came the way storms do, slow at first, then sudden. Caroline invited a handful of people to a location she described as a conference with a private estate. When I drove there the day she asked, I told myself it was a neutral thing. I told myself I was doing the right thing by going in, by letting the FBI have one more chance to gather words on tape. The place was a converted industrial space. Pallets, a high ceiling, the smell of old oil. It had been neutralized for discretion, poor lighting, a certain hush. Caroline liked these spaces. She liked the air of plausible deniability they offered. There were people there I had met in Caroline's orbit, Marcus, Linda, Victor, and there were others whose names I would learn later. Tommy, Susan, a man named Victor, who had an eye for details and a resume that made him appear respectable. The room hummed with low voices, the kind of murmur you hear when money is being counted in a laundering operation in a movie. But this was not a movie. At some point in the night, as the conversation drifted from banalities to plans, Caroline asked us carefully to demonstrate commitment. It was phrased as if commitment could be described like a virtue badge. She told a story about a problem that had arisen, an investigator who was making things difficult, and the tone suggested a solution that would be tidy. "Not all of our problems require force," she said, almost conversational, "but sometimes force is practical. We ask people to show they're serious." My heart did a strange animal loop. The microphone on my collar felt suddenly heavier. My hands curled into my palm. Daniel's signal came through a quick text. "Be ready." The hairs on my arms prickled. She did not tell me to kill anyone. She did not hand me a weapon. She proposed, instead, that someone would handle Agent Chen's removal in a way that would be deniable. Her words were precise, practiced. "We will make sure no one suspects," she said. "We will make it appear natural. A trip, an accident, anything. It is impossible to convey the internal calculus in words without making it sound theatrical. Let me be plain. The moral line was there, and she was asking me to step over it in exchange for belonging. She wanted me to show I was willing to be more than a face. She wanted me to show I was loyal. I told her, softly, that I was not willing. It came out steadier than my hands felt. The room grew very small, and a hush fell like a blanket. "You misunderstand me, Margaret," Caroline said, and she said it with the kind of thin patience a vice-like hand uses before it tightens. "We expect cooperation. People who choose not to cooperate sometimes make themselves difficult." I remember thinking of Agent Chen, small, attentive, the woman who had spent hours with me in a diner and made the law sound like something almost domestic. I could smell the coffee we'd had. I could see, very clearly, the badge she'd flashed in the bridal suite. The thought of harm to her made a coldness shoot through me like light through frost. The room changed then. Where before it had been a gathering that might have been social, it tilted into the outline of a council. The people in the room, some friendly, some only curious, shifted and began to speak in hypotheticals. There was a sense of pressure, a slow tightening. At that moment, I realized a dangerous truth. Refusing would make me interesting in a different way. If I declined, suddenly I'm a problem. If I accepted, I'd be complicit. If I delayed, I'd give them time to suspect treachery. I did the thing that later would be a crucial piece, because I believed in legal frameworks and because I trusted the people I was working with. I told Caroline I wanted her promises on paper. She laughed politely and said she never used contracts for that kind of thing, but that she respected my prudence and would put certain terms into an email. "Put it on paper," I said, feeling foolish and fierce at the same time. "Put it on paper, and we'll talk." Caroline's expression was a study in small victories. "Of course," she said. "We like transparency." The next week, Agent Chen moved in quiet ways. She shifted resources, plainclothes surveillance, pattern analysis, a roster of people ready to step in if a call came. Daniel worked around the clock, and I began to see him in a new light. Not just my son, but someone who had quietly assembled a team I had only imagined in the abstract. He was the kind of person who could turn paranoia into a plan. When the email from Caroline arrived, it was, as promised, a tidy thing. It made suggestions. It named obstacles and solutions, with an economy that made it sound like academic prose. She offered, in one paragraph, options for dealing with an investigator, and listed the costs in an offhand way. "Document it," Agent Chen said. "We have probable cause." We did. We saved every message, recorded every call and meeting, and sat through it like jurors. And then we planned. The sting was a choreography of small moves. We scheduled a large meeting under the guise of closing an arrangement. Caroline thought she was bringing a set of people to finalize terms. In reality, the government had layered surveillance, external teams, backup, legal schwarmers who could move in cleanly to avoid hurting the innocent. Daniel and I rehearsed our lines the way two frightened actors do. The night of the operation, the warehouse smelled of diesel and fresh paint. My dress was simple and dark. Agent Chen met me at the door and gave me a look that had no expression, but everything I needed. "We move when you give the signal," she said. "We have medics on site." I was wired. My hands felt like they belonged to a stranger. Caroline stood at the front, radiant in a way that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with control. She began her speech about loyalty and practical love, weaving a story about the people who got sordid when they couldn't be handled. Her voice was honey and steel. She asked again for signs of commitment. My stomach tightened. I did not say yes. Instead, I asked a question that was small and legal, and I hoped fatal to the warring narrative. "What happens if someone refuses?" I asked, loudly enough for the room to hear. There was a pause, a comet passing through the part of the evening that had been pretending to be ordinary. Then, in a corner near the pallets, a man I now know as Marcus made a move, and the team moved with him, not violently, but with a professionalism that meant they had rehearsed the moment of pressure on many nights. Someone came forward with what Mr. Marcus called a simple plan to relocate concerns. The word relocate rides a slippery slope. To a trained ear, it is a euphemism. To my ear that night, it sounded like something that might be plotted in a different country, where men took men away and the world pretended it had not happened. I felt fear the way you feel cold, slowly at first, then all at once. My heart hammered. Everything felt close and bright and fragile. Then, as if through a fog, something else occurred. One of Caroline's own people, Susan, a woman whose hands had trembled in little ways, said, "No, we can't do that." "We can't." Her voice was small, but it had a ring of sanity. She gave the reason. It was too public, too dangerous. Someone would talk. "People will always talk," Susan said, and the room's portrait of control cracked. That crack was what the FBI wanted to amplify. They moved in at that exact moment. Plainclothes agents stepped forward with badges, and the room's energy shifted into a column of pressure and legality. I felt hands on my shoulder. Agent Chen, steady and real. Then the arrests began. It was not cinematic, it was clinical. People were read their rights, guided politely to chairs, folded into sterile cuffs. Caroline, in the center, kept her composure until the last second. She looked at me as they led her away and said, "Margaret, you'll regret this." It was not a threat so much as a prophecy. We later learned that Caroline's network had been broader than we'd feared. Her reach spanned states. Each arrangement had rules and people who enforced them. The arrests that night pulled on threads across several jurisdictions. By the time we were into days of questioning and evidence gathering, the case had grown like a weed forced into the open. The team found shells, mailboxes registered in other names, small companies that existed on paper and not in practice. They found other women who had been targeted. Some of them had not yet realized they had been prey. I felt exhaustion like a physical thing. For days I moved through a fog of interviews. I gave statement after statement. I listened to other victims tell stories that were uncannily like mine. We compared notes like survivors trading scars. In the lull between interrogations, I would sit with Daniel, and sometimes we would simply look at each other and say nothing. The world had rearranged itself around that brutal, soft bone of reality. Some people will use your loneliness as a business model. The trial was a long and knotty thing. Caroline's defense was as thorough as her operations. She'd built plausible deniability into her life. Her lawyers argued that she had been a consultant, that any promises had been figurative, that the language of arrangement was metaphor. But we had recordings. We had emails. We had the warehouse meeting on tape where words like remove had been used and then politely glossed over. Legal argument can be a slow weapon. Evidence, when placed in front of a jury, becomes something that shows up like sunlight on a surface. Sitting in the courtroom was like living inside a score, parts written, each person playing the notes they'd rehearsed. I testified. I gave the statements I had recorded, spoke the words that had been said to me. I had not wanted to be a show witness. I had wanted to be a woman who had her life returned. But justice sometimes asks you to be a public thing for the sake of others. I told the truth the way the truth had been given to me in pieces. The boutonniere, the bridal suite, the dinner, the offers, the relocation language at the warehouse. I felt exposed and strange, like threadbare curtains left in the sun. The prosecution was methodical. They showed the jury a map of accounts, the the emails, the recordings. Each piece made the machine of Carolyn's operation look less theological and more mundane. The mundane is always the most terrifying kind of evil because it does not rely on mad genius so much as on patient, organized cruelty. The jury listened. At the end, they returned the verdict the way a relieved room unclenches. Caroline was convicted. So were several of her top lieutenants. Sentences were handed down that felt, to me, like a measure of relief more than vengeance. They were convicted on charges that included conspiracy to commit fraud and other related charges. Some received long sentences. Others received plea arrangements. The legal system, imperfect as it is, finally did what it was designed to. It made the people who had wielded pain accountable. After the verdicts, there was a slow, domestic recovery. The news outlets wanted statements, and people with good intentions brought casseroles and sympathy. I started going to a small group for people who'd been through similar things, a circle that met in a church basement and brought coffee and practical advice like change your passwords and let someone know if you plan a big meeting. There was humor in the group too, because sorrow and absurdity are companions. I found, oddly, that the work of telling the story performed a kind of doubling. It made me relive things in the service of making them legible to others, which in turn made the events feel less like an obtuse private injury and more like a shared lesson. I began speaking carefully at community organizations about elder fraud, about recognizing the signs, about not being ashamed to ask for help, about letting others know when you're taking on new relationships or deals. I learned the language of disclaimers and resources. I worked with a lawyer who helped us set up ways for older people to make their finances safer without infantilizing them. I talked with outreach groups who had been quietly gathering women who had been targeted in similar ways by copycat operations. There were other, quieter consequences. I had to relearn trust. I had to relearn the rhythms of ordinary life, the way to make lasagna without obsessing about who might sign my name on a deed, the way to sleep without counting possibilities. My relationship with Daniel deepened in ways I did not expect. He had always been my son, but now he was also the person who had steadied me when the world tried to move me like a chess piece. We became accomplices in ordinary things, grocery lists, calling the handyman, laughing at stupid television because carelessness is, sometimes, a blessing. I also found that I wanted to help. The rage that had at first burned the edges of my life had settled into a sternness that wanted fewer people to be prey. I began volunteering with a nonprofit focused on elder financial abuse. We held seminars where I spoke not as a legal expert, I'm not, but as someone who had been almost taken. I would tell the story, careful to leave out anything that would glorify the criminals, and then we would go into the practical, checking documents, getting a second opinion on new relationships that mention money early, not signing on dotted lines without legal counsel. People came to the meetings with stories that made my heart ache. We made a small community, a chain of people who called each other when something felt off. The courtroom verdict did not erase everything. There were long nights that still tasted of betrayal. There were anniversaries where I would, without warning, picture that boutonniere like a sting in my memory. There were people in town who listened to the news and met my eyes in a way that asked a question I didn't want to have to answer. But there were, too, things that came loose and new. A sense of authority when I spoke to others, the feeling that my story had been a tool that could stop predators in other places. I began to receive the kinds of messages you get when a story moves. Emails from women who had been targeted, calls from sons who were worried, invitations to speak. They were not just tokens of attention. They were reminders that the tiny, stubborn act of telling the truth had a ripple. In court, I had watched Caroline's face as the verdicts were read. She looked for a moment like a woman who finally realized she had placed her fate on the table and someone had taken it. She returned my look with a kind of measured contempt that could have been pity. I thought of that look as I testified to the jury, They do not pity you because they see you as broken. They pity when they realize the depths of your ordinary trust. I had little patience for pity then. I wanted repair. Years later, the reparations were not neat, but they arrived in forms that mattered. Some financial restitution, community programs that offered legal help to people who couldn't afford it, a local ordinance that made it easier to flag suspicious transfers for elderly accounts. None of this made the past vanish, but it did change the calculus for the next person. As for Daniel, he married Jessica months after the trials, in a quiet ceremony that felt, to me, like a vow spoken in private. Jessica had been complicit in the early staging. She pleaded guilty and testified. She was punished and, in time, tried to live on the less noisy side of the law. That Sunday at a small garden reception, I watched my son stand under a wisp of sunlight and say the words he'd saved his entire life. I thought about Tom and the way he would have sat in the corner nodding. I thought about how the world does not sufficiently reward ordinary kindness, but sometimes justice does manage to catch up to cruelty. People often ask what the hardest moment was. There are many: the bridal suite, the warehouse, the moment Caroline slid that business card across the table as if she were dealing in friendship. But the hardest was reconciling the idea that people you love can hold the world in their hands and the idea that others will try to take it. The real work, for me, was building boundaries that allowed love without leaving the door unlocked to predators. When I go out now and I meet other widows, other lonely people, I do 3 things. I listen. I ask a lot of small practical questions about documents and accounts, and I tell them they are not at fault for being human. Grief is not stupidity. It is an opening. It is also a place where predators like Caroline like to plant seeds. If telling my story helps one person lock a door and keep a little more money in their bank account, then all of this, every long interrogation, every sleepless night, has some purpose beyond pain. You asked earlier what it felt like the first time I saw Richard in that boutonniere. It felt like an image that turned my stomach into a stone. It also became, paradoxically, the hinge of a life I did not expect to take on. It made me angry, yes, but it also made me fierce. It taught me that grief can be weaponized by others, but grief can also forge resolve. If you're seeing this and it speaks to you, if grief has left you open, or if you worry about someone older in your life, please reach out to local resources. Talk to your children if you can. Keep copies of financial records in a safe place. Let someone you trust know when a new person is getting involved in your affairs. There is no shame in asking for help. I never wanted to be the sort of person who tells a true crime story to an audience, but I am glad for the witness it creates. I am glad for the women who reached out after the trial with stories that began with a lonely phone call and ended with their lives intact because someone else had been willing to listen. I am glad that Daniel used his skill to protect more than just us, and I am glad that, in the end, the law did the hard work that vengeance could not. I still keep Tom's cardigan folded. I still buy peonies in June and wonder at the ways memory arranges itself. I still carry the image of that boutonniere, the small white flower that somehow stood for the whole architecture of deceit. But now, when I see a boutonniere, sometimes I also think of the many people who stepped in to stop it from becoming the symbol of ruin. If you've been through anything like what I am telling, you are not alone. Your voice matters. Share the story in the comments if you're comfortable. If you want to hear more true stories about people who survive and fight back, please subscribe. There are more voices that need to be heard, and sometimes the smallest audience can change the world for someone else. Thank you for listening.